All right, my friends, J.R. Dukes here. Appreciate you joining me. We are going to go live to the United Nations. This is a live feed directly from the United Nations in New York City. They are taking up some amendments pertaining to Israel, motions to condemn Israel. They have a list of different things they're going to debate. So we're going to watch it live and see exactly what happens at this particular meeting. So stand by as we go live.
The President will now deliver a statement.
Okay, you are watching live the floor of the United Nations. The President of the United Nations is about to speak. This guy is a character, so I'll make comments later, but here we go.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, this past week, it was with a very heavy heart that I read the letter addressed to me by UNRWA Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini. That letter, on which many of your missions were also copied, highlighted the devastating deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. As Commissioner General Lazzarini himself predicted in his letter, the situation has since deteriorated further. Right now, what we are seeing is an onslaught on civilians, the breakdown of humanitarian systems, and profound disrespect for both international law and international humanitarian law. As I said before, even war has rules, and it is imperative that we prevent any deviation from these principles and values, the validity of which resides in their universal application. Tens of thousands have been killed, almost 70% of them women and children. Even more have been forcibly displaced by the incessant violence, with nowhere, I repeat, nowhere safe to go. And the targeting of hospitals, schools, and UN-provided shelters, now so overcrowded that they have ceased to function as safe havens, continues unabated. All the while, the blockade on humanitarian assistance has made the delivery of urgently needed life-saving aid near impossible. Excellencies, clearly, what we are witnessing is the unprecedented collapse of an already crumbling humanitarian system in real time. It is incumbent upon us, as the United Nations, to bring an immediate end to the suffering of innocent civilians, the mounting death toll of those who are not, I repeat, are not combatants in this war, and to this untenable humanitarian catastrophe. Thanks to several countries' relentless efforts, a temporary humanitarian truce enabled the release of hostages, the freeing of detainees, and the delivery of some aid. However, since the 1st of December, we are witnessing the resumption of violence with a kind of ferocity that one asks, what more next? Civilians should never undergo the level of suffering we are currently witnessing. And again, I ask, how many more thousands of lives must be lost before we do something? No more time is left. The carnage must stop. For as long as this violence persists, a political solution to this conflict will continue to be undermined. The longer it takes, the higher the risk that a negotiated two-state solution will increasingly become out of reach. So the fact of the matter is, quite simply, the violence must stop. It must. I therefore once again add my voice to the demand for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We have one singular priority, only one: to save lives. Excellencies, casting our gaze towards the future, we must assess the situation with honesty in our hearts, truth in our words, and a commitment to peace as our utmost ambition. A ceasefire is the only realistic first step towards de-escalating tensions. How can we possibly listen to each other over the deafening thundering of bombs? On 26th October, you gathered in this chamber with the membership resoundingly and unequivocally calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. On December 7th, once more, a veto was cast in the Security Council. Once again, this emergency special session has been resumed. We certainly cannot continue in this way without even the possibility, let alone the prospect, for a meaningful solution. As President of the General Assembly, I am committed to supporting any and all efforts to put an end to the bloodshed and the psychological torture of the people in Gaza. I used my recent attendance at the Doha Forum and every other platform I can to encourage cooperation among states with the same singular goal in mind: to make peace for all. In the name of humanity, I ask you all once again, stop this violence now. I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt to introduce draft resolution A/ES 10/L27.
Sayyid Rais.
Mr. President, I thank you on behalf of the Arab group for quickly heeding our call to hold this meeting. The call from the Arab and Islamic groups in an attempt to overcome the obstruction of the Security Council's attempts to shoulder its responsibilities by calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in the occupied Palestinian territory. there was an extensive use of the veto against the humanitarian ceasefire draft resolution, even though it was supported by more than 100 member states within a few hours in the United Nations. This is a sign that the majority of the international community is well aware of the seriousness of the current situation and its repercussions, its tragic repercussions on international peace and security. Mr. President, the draft resolution tabled today, A/ES 10/L27, is very simple, clear, and explicit. It only includes 4 operative paragraphs. However, the implementation of these paragraphs has yet to happen by the international community for 2 months. Even though the tragic humanitarian situation is unbearable for the Palestinians. They are subjected to barbaric attacks by Israeli occupation forces against civilians in Gaza. This has led to an unbearable humanitarian suffering. It has threatened international peace and security. This is why the Secretary General of the United Nations, and for the first time since he took office and for several decades, decided to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter to call specifically for what this draft resolution is calling for, namely a humanitarian ceasefire. Because the Israeli aggression destroyed the health system, there are concerns of a demise of the public order and the humanitarian support system in Gaza. It is impossible to provide humanitarian assistance there, and this is why the Commissioner General of UNRWA spoke to you and sent you a letter to shed light on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and its impact on UNRWA's capacity to shoulder its mandate and how it affects the safety and security of UNRWA staff. Mr. President, the Arab group stresses that the efforts by a minority of states that are standing against international public opinion, which is calling for a ceasefire, are using void pretexts and justifications in saying that Israel has the right to defend itself. This is a deliberate sign. And we would like to say that this right does not apply to Israel because it is the occupying power. It's occupying the occupied Palestinian territories. And this right does not absolve Israel from committing to the implementation of international law and protecting innocent civilians, women, and children during wars. These tragic attempts are a despicable sign of double standards. Some countries are calling for stopping the aggression, stopping the war, stopping the occupation, and stopping attacks on civilians, and for respecting the international humanitarian law and international law in specific cases. However, and unfortunately and shamelessly, they turn their back to these calls in other situations, especially when they're related to Palestinians and their right to live in security on their territory, in their independent state, to stop the war crimes against Palestinians. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the adoption and the implementation of the draft resolution by the General Assembly today, which is specifically calling for a ceasefire, is the only guarantee for saving innocent civilians. Paragraph 6 of the preamble is very balanced and neutral, despite what some might claim. It stresses the need for protecting civilians from both sides in line with the international humanitarian law. The draft resolution is calling in its operative paragraphs upon all parties to commit to the protection of civilians and the release of all hostages and to ensure humanitarian access. Mr. President, the perpetration of this destructive war will lead to a full-fledged catastrophe. This will unfortunately mean that genocide will be used as a tool for war, completely disregarding international law. This will lead the region to a full-fledged war, and it will jeopardize the credibility of this international organization. Mr. President, the Arab Group calls upon all member states to support the draft resolution before you today, to prevent any double standards and to protect international values, to support collective interests, and to protect international peace and security. We also call upon all delegations to vote against any amendments proposed, because they were not discussed with the sponsor countries. This is to protect the balance of the text. The text was drafted so as to go in line with the draft resolution tabled at the Security Council to achieve the main priority, the number one priority, a very clear and specific objective, namely a humanitarian ceasefire. Let us not confuse things, because some delegations have proposed amendments, whereas they voted against the draft resolution at the General Assembly that was adopted last year. In this emergency special session, which called for a humanitarian pause that will eventually lead to a cessation of hostilities. This unveils the true objective behind these amendments, namely the continuation of the aggression and the bloodshed. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, what are we all waiting for to stop this fire? What are we waiting for to end this zero-sum war? What are we waiting for to stop the killing and stop the destructive war machine? Can we wait? Can we even wait when the number of civilians killed has gone beyond 18,000, including more than 7,000 children, with one child dying every 10 minutes? And when the number of the injured has exceeded 49,000 people? Excellencies, I am speaking to you, to your conscience today. I am calling upon you to support the draft resolution to stop the bloodshed.
Honorable President, I sincerely ask you, Mr. President, to suspend the debate following the introductions to proceed to take action on the draft resolution A/ES/10/L25 without delay, given the urgency of the situation on the ground and the importance of a global call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, with the understanding that the debate would resume immediately after action and the adoption of the resolution, and that emergency session 10 would only be temporarily adjourned after the conclusion of the debate. And I do thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria to introduce Amendment A/ES10/L28.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, I have the honor to introduce to you draft amendment L28, proposed by Austria on resolution L27, entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. We meet today in this emergency special session to address the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Austria is deeply concerned by the escalation following the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israeli civilians on 7 October. As our President stressed earlier, Austria has also continuously underlined the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times. Every civilian death is one too many. We have also called on more humanitarian aid to reach those in need and have increased our own contributions to humanitarian organizations. We very much welcome the humanitarian pauses and corridors that enable the release of some hostages and the provisions of urgently needed humanitarian aid. The recent escalation of violence started with Hamas' brutal, indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel on 7 October, and this deserves to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. As any state that suffers such an attack, Israel also has the right to defend its citizens in line with international law and international humanitarian law, and will therefore also support the amendment introduced by the United States. Austria has thoroughly considered the draft resolution before us today. We recognize the efforts by the Arab group to present a short and concise text, and we welcome that this text, in comparison to the resolution presented in October, explicitly demands the release of all hostages and also demands humanitarian access. However, this resolution falls short in many ways, including the right of Israel to ensure its citizens are safe and in naming the terrorist group responsible for the taking of hostages. The innocent children, women and men held captive in Gaza have not simply disappeared or lost their way. They were abducted by Hamas. We can't just ignore this fact. The reports of those freed clearly show Hamas' brutality and complete disregard for human dignity. It's with this purpose that Austria presented a short, constructive amendment that's based on agreed language from UN Security Council Resolution 2712, adopted on 15 November of this year. This resolution called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, and ensuring immediate humanitarian access. This is the exact language that our amendment that we are proposing today proposes to add. We are here today because there was another veto in the UN Security Council. And just a few weeks ago, the Security Council was able to name Hamas in a resolution that was adopted. The UN General Assembly should also have the courage to do the same. We therefore ask all of you to support the amendment we have put before you and vote yes. If that amendment passes, Austria will be able to join others in abstaining on the whole text. We will also continue working with all partners to ensure safety and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. All of them, Palestinians, Israelis, deserve a peaceful future and the restoration of a political process leading to a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States to introduce the draft amendment in A/ES10/L29. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, the last 2 months have been nothing short of devastating. Devastating for Palestinians who have lost their homes and their loved ones because of a conflict that Hamas set into motion. Devastating for Israelis who still face a barrage of rocket fire even as they continue to reel from Hamas's barbaric attacks on October 7th. Devastating for Jewish and Muslim people around the world who are targeted by rising levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And devastating for all those who dream of a sustainable peace in which Israelis and Palestinians enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. That sustainable peace is what the United States wants to work towards. And that is what I believe so many members of this body want to work towards too. And indeed, there are aspects of this resolution that we do support. We agree that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire and requires urgent and sustained attention, that civilians desperately need food and water and shelter and medical care, that a devastating number of innocent people have been killed, and that civilians must be protected, consistent with international humanitarian law. In addition, we support the release of all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Roughly half of those kidnapped on October 7th remain in Gaza. That's over 100 people, subject to, as a number of released hostages have described, hell. And so we encourage you to vote yes on the amendment proposed by Austria, which, like the resolution passed in the Security Council on November 15th, call for Hamas and other groups to release the hostages and to provide humanitarian access to them immediately. Again, we support components of the resolution proposed today. But here's what else we support. We support speaking out with one voice to condemn Hamas for its terrorist actions on October 7th. Why is that so hard? To say unequivocally that murdering babies and gunning down parents in front of their children is horrific, that burning down houses while families shelter inside and taking civilians hostage is abhorrent. It's why today the United States is proposing an amendment that unequivocally rejects and condemns these atrocities. And we urge all members to vote yes and declare that what happened on October 7th is intolerable, period. This is the bare minimum, and it should not be that difficult. In addition, the United States supports immediately addressing the reports of horrific sexual violence unleashed by Hamas on and after October 7th. Over the last 20 years, the UN has repeatedly underscored the need to investigate all reports of conflict-related sexual violence. It's long past time every member apply that same standard to the assaults committed by Hamas. The United States also supports the ICRC having access to hostages to provide medical treatment. We support a resumption of humanitarian pauses, which could happen immediately if Hamas only agreed to release women, wounded, and civilian hostages. We have seen how critical these pauses are to get the hostages out and to give some respite to civilians and humanitarians in Gaza. Look, there's no shortage of rhetoric here in New York, but it's the diplomacy the United States is engaging in on the ground that made that week-long pause possible. It was careful conversation and collaboration with Egypt and Qatar that helped reunite more than 100 hostages with their loved ones, and that dramatically expanded humanitarian assistance to Gaza during the break in fighting. Of course, we support even more aid getting into the hands of those who so urgently need it. Over the last week and a half, the United States has airlifted more than 90,000 pounds of humanitarian aid to Egypt's border, with more on the way. and we're working with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and others to surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Israel's decision to open Kerem Shalom for inspections and screening of those humanitarian goods is essential and something we have been working toward in earnest. And Israel's commitment to ensure there's enough fuel to sustain the humanitarian assistance operation, including civilian infrastructure, is also vital. We've made clear to Israel we expect it to honor these commitments, and we will hold them to it. Colleagues, there's more we support. We support a more robust deconfliction mechanism to help protect UN and humanitarian personnel, far too many of whom have lost their lives while heroically working to save innocent people in Gaza. We support affirming that Israel, like every single country on earth, has the right and the responsibility to defend its people from acts of terrorism. Because we know that Hamas intends to repeat the horrors of October 7th again and again and again. A senior Hamas official said so himself on television. Indeed, it was Hamas that broke the 7-day pause last month by committing a vicious terror attack in Jerusalem, firing rockets into Israel, and then failing to release the hostages it had pledged to release. Let's be realistic here. This is a terrorist group that no member state would tolerate living next to. So long as Hamas remains driven by its murderous ideology, any ceasefire right now would be temporary at the best and dangerous at worst. Dangerous to Israelis, who would be subject to relentless attacks, and also dangerous to Palestinians, who deserve the chance to build a better future for themselves, free from Hamas, a group that hides behind innocent civilians rather than protect them, and that co-opts civilian infrastructure to wage conflict. Of course, how Israel defends itself matters. Israel must avoid mass displacement of civilians in the south of Gaza. It must ensure sufficient humanitarian assistance to those who have fled violence, and it must allow civilians in Gaza to return home as soon as conditions allow. We will continue to press at the highest levels for this and for the protection of civilians as Israel pursues legitimate military objectives. Because perhaps most of all, while we cannot support a one-sided Security Council or General Assembly resolution that ignores so much of what we all stand for, we desperately want to see an end to the cycle of unceasing violence. Colleagues, our goal must be to stop the death, the devastation, and the destruction for the long term. And that is simply not a future Hamas wants to see. So as we address this immediate crisis and work to surge humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, we must also work to build a foundation for a truly sustainable peace, one where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in states of their own, so that the next generation and the generations to come need not experience the devastation of the last 2 months and finally realize freedom, security, and peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the United States. The representative of Egypt has moved that the debate on agenda item 5 be suspended at this stage for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of Draft Resolution AES-10 L27, and that the debate would continue after the action on the draft resolution. It is my understanding that, without setting a precedent and given the urgency of the issue, if the Assembly were to decide to suspend the debate at this stage, for the Assembly to proceed to the consideration of Draft Resolution A/ES10/L27, and to continue the debate after the action on the draft resolution, and if the Assembly were to adopt the draft resolution subsequently, the 10th Emergency Special Session would be adjourned temporarily following the conclusion of the debate on item 5. Is there any objection to the motion? I see none. It is so decided. Since there is, the Assembly shall now proceed to consider the draft resolution A/ES10/L27 and draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29. For your information, the draft resolution and draft amendments have closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Folks, in case you're wondering, they are continuing debating the UN resolutions pertaining to the Israel-Gaza war.
I should like to announce that since
And
the
we'll continue
submission
listening in.
of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES10/L27: Afghanistan, Angola, Antigua and Barbuda, Azerbaijan, Bahamas, Bangladesh, Barbados, Belarus, Belgium, Belize, Benin, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Botswana, Brazil, Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, the Central African Republic, Chad, Chile, China, Colombia, Congo, Costa Rica, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Dominica, El Salvador, Ethiopia, Fiji, Finland, Gambia, Grenada, Guyana, Honduras, Iceland, Indonesia, Ireland, Jamaica, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Lesotho, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Maldives, Malta, Mexico, Myanmar, Namibia, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Norway, Peru, Philippines, Portugal, the Russian Federation, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, San Marino, Senegal, Singapore, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Sri Lanka, Suriname, Tajikistan, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Trinidad and Tobago, Turkey, Turkmenistan, Uganda, Uzbekistan, Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES10/L27, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. Guinea-Bissau, Eritrea, Zambia,
In case anybody's wondering, the /27, that's the main resolution itself, where they're calling for an immediate ceasefire in the
Mozambique I
Israel-Gaza
already said,
war.
so that's it for this one.
The United States is
then I would
opposed, so
like
it
to
should
go
fail,
to,
but we'll continue listening in.
L20
If you have any comments, put them below for me.
And I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft amendment, and in addition to the delegation listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES10/L28: Albania, Canada, Cyprus, Czechia, Greece, Japan, Lithuania, Montenegro, Ukraine, and the United States of America. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES10/L28, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. United Kingdom, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Micronesia, that's it. And then I would like to go now to L29. I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft amendment, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES10/L29: Albania, Austria, Canada, Cyprus, Czechia, Germany, Greece, Japan, Lithuania, Montenegro, and Ukraine. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/ES10/L29, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. United Kingdom, Fiji, Micronesia, and Papua New Guinea. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. The Assembly will now proceed to take action on the draft resolution contained in A/ES10/L27 and amendments thereto contained in A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29. Delegations wishing to make a statement in explanation of vote before the vote on any of the proposals under this item, including the proposed amendments, are invited to do so now in one intervention. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me start by expressing our gratitude to you for having convened this resumption of the emergency special session of the General Assembly, and in particular for your clarion call for an immediate ceasefire in the war that is taking place in Gaza. Mr. President, Pakistan supports the draft resolution submitted by the Arab and Islamic countries in L27. The resolution is identical in its text to the one which was voted upon in the Security Council, and its aim is to seek an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, to provide access for humanitarian assistance, and to call for the release of all, I repeat, all hostages. This resolution was co-sponsored by over 100 member states when it was submitted in the Security Council. It obtained the affirmative votes of 13 of the 15 Council members, but it failed to pass due to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Security Council. Yet, the international community is not without recourse. The UN Charter provides the General Assembly with considerable residual powers, and acting under the Uniting for Peace process, we can take action to demand a halt to the war which is taking place and killing thousands of people every week. The draft resolution is one we are confident will elicit the support of the vast majority of the UN membership. Pakistan has not co-sponsored this draft resolution, and we have not done so because we reserve the right to submit amendments to ensure that the text which is adopted by the General Assembly is equitable and balanced. And it is a matter, therefore, of deep regret, if not surprise, that some friends of Israel have introduced amendments to once again condemn only one side, but exonerate the other. Unlike Canada, I cannot appeal to their sense of equity and justice. But what we can do is to appeal to the sense of humanity, of justice and fairness of the rest of the UN membership. And I'm confident that this entire membership will not agree to place the blame only on Hamas, but not on Israel. That would be unjust, unfair, and inequitable. Mr. President, when you deny people freedom and dignity, when you humiliate and trap them in an open-air prison where you kill them as if they were beasts, they become very angry, and they do to others what was done to them. And therefore, for Austria and my friend from the United States to blame Hamas in their amendments is not equitable, is not just. The blame, if it's to be placed, has to be placed on both parties, and especially on Israel. Mr. President, with the end of the pause, the skies over Gaza are filled with projectiles of death. Attack helicopters, drones, artillery shells, tank shells, mortars, bombs, missiles. Israel has dropped 25,000 tons of explosives on Gaza, nearly the equivalent of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Israel's goal is not only to erase Hamas. This is a war against the Palestinian people. Israel's goal is to erase not only a people, but the entire idea of Palestine. Its campaign is a carbon copy of the massive campaigns of racial slaughter by other settler colonial regimes in history. Mr. President, over 18,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, another 42,000 wounded, and more than 1.8 million people, over 80% of Gaza's population, have been driven from their homes. Thousands are missing, buried under the rubble. And yet Israel is not deterred. Is this any form of legitimate self-defense when you can kill 18,000 civilians with impunity and enjoy the protection in the Security Council against action? Therefore, I would appeal to all the membership to see this one-sided slaughter that is taking place. If Hamas is named and not Israel, you will provide a justification to the Israeli war machine to continue its roulette wheel of death. I believe that this is not the intention of the membership of the United Nations, to justify, to give a justification for the genocide that is taking place. I would therefore, on behalf of my delegation, on behalf of all the Arab countries, on behalf of the OIC, appeal to all the membership to vote against the amendments proposed in L28 by Austria and L29 by the United States. In case these amendments are adopted, Pakistan will submit sub-amendments to these in order to restore balance, in order to name Israel as the perpetrator of the mass crimes that are taking place in Gaza today. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan, and I now call on the representative of Israel to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, again, we find ourselves about to vote upon yet another hypocritical resolution. Not only does this resolution fail to condemn Hamas for their crimes against humanity, it doesn't even mention Hamas at all. This is a resolution that will only prolong the death and destruction in the region. That is precisely what a ceasefire means. Colleagues, on October 6th, there was a ceasefire, and it was abruptly violated. Not by Israel, but by 3,000 Hamas Nazis who invaded my country, raping women, beheading babies, burning families alive, and deliberately exterminating innocent civilians like insects. What would your countries do if you were in Israel's shoes? Call for a ceasefire? What would Moscow do? Beijing? Istanbul? How would you respond? Everyone here knows exactly. On December 1st, there was another pause in place. And again, it was violently ended by Hamas ISIS, who refused to release women held hostage and continued to fire rockets and missiles on our town and cities. Hamas raped women, committed heinous acts of sexual violence, took women and girls hostage, and is not only refusing to release them, but is also refusing the Red Cross's access to them. There are no war crimes more heinous than the atrocities Hamas committed, and those that support this resolution are giving the terrorists a free pass. A ceasefire means one thing and one thing only: ensuring the survival of Hamas. ensuring the survival of genocidal terrorists committed to the annihilation of Israel and Jews. This is no secret. Hamas's charter makes this clear, and Hamas leaders have publicly stated that October 7th was just a rehearsal. They have declared that they will repeat their atrocities again and again until Israel ceases to exist. So why would anyone want to aid Hamas in continuing their rule of terror and actualizing their satanic agenda? We all know that the so-called humanitarian ceasefire in this resolution has nothing to do with humanity. Israel is already taking every measure to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Thousands of aid trucks have entered with tens of thousands of tons of humanitarian aid. Field hospitals have been constructed. Floating hospital ships have been docked. And the only reason more aid is not entering Gaza is because UN bodies refuse to solve the logistical difficulties preventing all aid trucks waiting in Rafah from entering. If this resolution's true intent was humanitarian aid, it would be focused on improving the UN's logistical capabilities, not on a ceasefire. A ceasefire will only benefit the terrorists that steal the humanitarian aid for themselves. It will not benefit the people of Gaza. Is this your solution? What will happen the day after the ceasefire? Will this bring peace and stability to the region? Of course not. A ceasefire is a death sentence for countless more Israelis and Gazans. By voting in favor of this resolution, you are supporting the survival of jihadist terror and the continued suffering of people of Gaza. The exploitation of the Palestinians has made the UN a moral stain on humanity. Why are you continuing to allow them to make the United Nations irrelevant? If this body's intentions are just, why don't you just start by demanding a ceasefire only from those responsible for violating the past too? Why don't you hold the rapists and child murderers accountable? The time has come to put the blame where it belongs, on the shoulders of the Hamas monsters. But this resolution does not even condemn Hamas. It doesn't even mention Hamas. I honestly don't know how can someone look in the mirror and support a resolution that doesn't condemn Hamas and doesn't even mention Hamas by name. So at the very last, I urge you to vote for adding a condemnation of Hamas to the resolution. But you know what? I have an idea. If you want a real ceasefire, here is the right address. This is the phone number of Hamas's office in Gaza. You can all call +970 599 3765 and ask for Yihya Sinwar. Tell Hamas to put down their arms, turn themselves in, and return our hostages. This will bring a complete ceasefire that will last forever. So why are you not doing this? Why are you not holding Hamas accountable? Ironically, today is the United Nations International Day of Neutrality, the day on which the UN reminds itself to be an impartial mediator in de-escalating conflict. Ignoring the war crimes of genocidal terrorists on today of all days, this body further proves its utter irrelevance. What a disgrace. But this resolution's absurdity goes further than protecting genocidal terrorists. This resolution is a written paradox. On the one hand, it calls for a ceasefire. Yet, on the other hand, it calls for the release of all hostages, all. Have you forgotten who you are dealing with? Have you forgotten that Hamas, the terror organization holding the hostages, has zero respect for international law? A useless resolution will not secure the release of hostages. In fact, Mr. President, a ceasefire will only ensure that their suffering is extended at the hands of the terrorists. Hamas does not respond to General Assembly resolutions. Hamas responds only to threats on its survival. Continuing Israel's operation in Gaza is the only way any hostages will be released. This disgraceful resolution serves only one purpose: to try to tie Israel's hands and allow Hamas to continue its reign of terror. Colleagues, this institution was founded in the wake of the Holocaust. It was established to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. But by supporting this resolution, you are doing exactly the opposite. You are voting in favor of a genocidal jihadist organization. Mr. President, unlike our enemies, Israel believes in life and peace, not brazen violence. No piece of paper, especially one that is adopted by a biased, politicized majority, will prevent Israel from defending itself against those that seek our destruction. Israel is fighting a war for her future. There is not a single member state here, that would act differently in a similar situation. A ceasefire only serves to prolong Hamas's reign of terror, so I urge all member states to vote against this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the State of Israel for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa on behalf of the African states.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am delivering the statement, explanation of vote before the vote on behalf of my country, South Africa. We thank you for convening this emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly, which has been called because of yet another failure of the Security Council to fulfill its mandate. We thank the Arab Group and the OIC respectively for requesting the resumption of the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly. On 6 December, the Secretary General took the initiative to invoke Article 99 of the UN Charter, bringing to the attention of the Security Council a matter which, in his opinion, may aggravate existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security. South Africa commends the Secretary General for taking this initiative, and we remain steadfast in calling for an immediate, comprehensive ceasefire to assess the needs on the ground, allowing for the full opening of all humanitarian corridors to grant much-needed aid and basic services to reach those in need. We therefore emphasize the urgent implementation of General Assembly resolutions to realize this and alleviate the suffering of Palestinians in desperate need of relief aid. The Secretary General's initiative was necessary in the context of the inability of the Council to, at the very least, call for a humanitarian ceasefire. The international institutions created at the end of the Second World War, including the United Nations, human rights instruments, and judicial mechanisms, were established so that history would not repeat the cruelty experienced during the war. Yet, by failure to act, to call for an end to the loss of civilian life, it has become clear that there is a selective application of the international instruments and the utilization of some of these mechanisms for attaining narrow interests. This has resulted in calling to questions the effectiveness of the system. As members of the General Assembly, this emergency special session presents an opportunity for us to illustrate that the organization that was created to give hope for peace is not tone deaf to the suffering of the most vulnerable. The ESS is an opportunity for us to illustrate that we are able to take on the responsibility entrusted to us by the UN Charter and international law, and call for an immediate ceasefire and not condone war in the name of self-defense. The events of the past 6 weeks in Gaza have illustrated that Israel is acting contrary to its obligation in terms of the Genocide Convention. As a UN member state, and owing to South Africa's painful past experience of a system of apartheid, this impresses on us as member states to take action in accordance with international law. Mr. President, an issue we cannot also ignore is the failure of member states of this organization to abide by the decision taken on 27 October 2023. South Africa was among more than 2/3 of the member states that called for an immediate ceasefire at the General Assembly. This has been ignored. We cannot proclaim the importance of international law and the importance of the UN Charter in some situations and not in others, as if the rule of law only applies to a select few. For international law and our moral obligations to be credible, it should be uniformly applied and not be selective. We have all signed the Charter. Let us commit to and respect decisions taken in accordance with the Charter. Mr. President, the lack of meaningful action from the United Nations indicates that more than ever before, reform of the system of global governance so that it is fair, equitable, and has the capacity to respond to the needs of all persons in situations of threat and harm is urgently needed. The system that is needed should not just be a tool for the most powerful countries of the world, but one that provides protection for the most vulnerable. The inadequacy of the UN Security Council, which has a mandate derived from the UN Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security, has become glaring. The Security Council, due to aggravated politicization, has not at the very least been able to call for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow for much needed humanitarian supplies to go to those that need it the most. This once again demonstrates the urgent need for the reform of this body. Mr. President, South Africa supports the G8 draft resolution L27 being considered this afternoon, protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. I thank you.
We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES 10/L27 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of the draft resolution. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore also required for the adoption of the amendments to the draft resolution. Before we proceed to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES10/L27, in accordance with Rule 90 of the Rules of Procedure, the Assembly shall first take a decision on draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29 one by one. We now turn to draft amendment AES10L28. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process.
What they're doing, folks, J.R.
Those
Duke's
in
back with
favor
you.
of
They're going to take
draft
the amendments
amendment
first and then go ahead and vote on the actual resolution number 27.
ES10/L28, please signify. Those against and abstentions.
Okay, L28 is one of the amendments.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft amendment A/ES10/L28. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are correctly reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows.
All right, as you can see on your
89
screen,
in favor,
looks like it passed 89 votes.
61 against, and 20 abstentions. Having failed to obtain the required two-thirds majority, draft amendment A/ES10/L28 is not adopted.
All right, even though it looks on your screen that it had a majority of the votes, it has to have a two-third majority vote. So basically an abstention is a no vote as far as the UN is
We
concerned.
now turn to draft amendment A/ES10/L29.
This
A
is the
recorded
second of
vote
the
has
last
been
amendments,
requested.
the L29
We
amendment.
shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft amendment A/ES10/L29, please signify. Those against and abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft amendment A/ES10/L29. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are correctly reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
Looks like a repeat of the previous vote.
The result of the vote is as follows. 84 in favor, 62 against, 25 abstentions. Having failed to obtain the required two-thirds majority, draft amendment A/ES10/L29 is not adopted.
Yeah, that one failed.
Since draft amendments A/ES10/L28 and A/ES10/L29 were not adopted, we shall proceed to take action on draft resolution A/ES10/L27.
All right, this is the main one
Assembly
right
will
here.
now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES10/L27 entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES10/L27, please signify. Those against, and abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES10/L27 entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are correctly reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. And please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows: 153 in favor, 10 against, 23 abstentions. Draft resolution A/ES10/L27 has been adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, the Second Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld, did one day say that the United Nations organization was not established to take us to heaven, but rather to prevent us
All right,
from
my friends,
sliding
we
into
have
hell.
what we have here is the completion of what we've been following in the UN straight from New York City. Now, I will have to double check on the facts, but even though that last resolution, what they call the L27, passed as far as the vote is concerned, I don't think anything is enforceable as far as the UN is concerned because it has to go through the Security Council. The United States, of course, has a permanent seat on the Security Council. So anything that is binding on Israel would obviously be vetoed as a sitting member of the Security Council by the United States. So even though something technically might have passed, I do not believe it has anything as far as being binding on the state of Israel. We have to go ahead and commend the Israeli representative. He really took the UN to task, as he should have, by pointing out that there was a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas before October 7th. And then, of course, on October 7th, they were savagely attacked by Hamas. And I think it was roughly 12 to 1,300 Israelis were raped, killed, mutilated, tortured, burnt. Go ahead and use your own adjective. It's just absolutely appalling. Crimes like this probably have not been seen since the Holocaust. So a very serious situation. It's really stunning that the United Nations would act the way they act towards Israel. I frankly just don't understand it. There are some people in this world that obviously choose to remain blind. If you were attacked like that, you have a right to self-defense. Being proportionate does not matter. I can assure you, if the United States was attacked in that way, the United States would move everything necessary to make sure that the organization, the people responsible, were eliminated from the face of the earth, just like we did with ISIS back from 9/11. You have a right to self-defense, people, and don't let anybody feed you any kind of BS telling you otherwise. So I would encourage you, as the Bible says, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for the Israeli people, and obviously pray for our great country. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Always hit that thumbs up button. Make sure you stay tuned as I go live and as I bring you videos. I generally post daily, so I appreciate you joining me. It's been my pleasure. Keep that free mind and never give up, my friends. Until next time, I am J.R. Dukes.